Welcome back to the Rock Your Retirement Show. I'm your host, Kathy Klein, and today we have Tay Kim in this series from the Sandwich Generation. Now, if you listened last week, you know that Tay is coming from the perspective of a 30-something who has small children. Most of my listeners are probably on the other end of that. You're probably in the grandparents section. So if you are living or want to consider living in a multi-generational household, you must listen to this series. If you didn't listen to last week's show, you might want to head on over there and listen to it first. In last week's episode, we spoke about what the sandwich generation is and what issues you might face if you are a 30-something and you're taking care of both your parents and your own children. But we also looked at it from the perspective of the grandparent, the people who listen to this show. What could you expect if you wound up moving in with your children? It can help you and your children save money, and so you can both have a better life. Today, we're going to be talking about 6 lessons for the sandwich generation. Next week, we'll talk about the pros and cons of multi-generational living. And in the 4th episode, we'll discuss tips for living in a multi-generational household. This includes things like planning ahead and organizing shared expenses. So if you are considering moving in with your children, or if you know someone who's having financial challenges, then this series is for you. My guest today is a blogger who writes about finances and also being in the sandwich generation. Tay and his wife cohabitate with his aging parents while raising their own small children and building their careers. But before we start, I wanted to tell you that this episode is brought to you by the Medicare Quick Step-by-Step Guide for signing up for Medicare. This step-by-step guide is absolutely free and will help you easily make the transition into Medicare. Get it free at medicarequick.com/checklist. Tay, thank you so much for coming back. And let's talk now about the article that we're discussing, which is called The 6 Lessons for the Sandwich Generation. And I do know that you could probably have written this article, and I've got it pulled up on my screen right now. The listener, we're testing a program that allows Tay and I to view the same thing at the same time so we can talk about the article. One of the things that it says in the very beginning is that you and your parents should talk about money. Is this something that you and your parents have done?
Not exactly, but we are aware of each other's finances. I think the importance of what the article is talking about is you want to have as much information as possible on both ends. So the way my wife and I started living together with my parents, as we referred to in the last episode, was a good part of it was finances. So my wife and I, we live in Orange County, Southern California, where housing is very expensive. My wife and I were typical millennial, where we started off our marriage about 8 years ago with $105,000 in student loans.
Wow,
Not the best.
$105,000. That's incredible.
Yeah, not the smartest decision. It's a funny story where my wife and I, when we were engaged, I remember my wife, she wanted to have this serious conversation, and she was like, I have to tell you something. And I was like, oh, like, what is it? And I was like, it was super serious. I was like, oh my goodness, like, have you been married before? Do you have a kid somewhere? And she says, I have $15,000 in student loans.
And then
and I had 90,000. So I responded back, I was like, haha, don't worry, honey. I have 90,000. I see your 15. I countered that with my 90.
Tay, were you concerned that if she was so concerned about 15,000 that she might not want to marry you since you had 90,000?
She already said yes at that moment. It was after we got engaged.
So she couldn't take the engagement back. That's it. Once she said yes.
She could have, but thankfully she didn't. Thankfully, she committed to the burden that I was bringing to the marriage.
Now, you have a great story about what you did after you got married. You are a follower of somebody who helps people get out of debt. Do you want to tell that story?
Yes, yes. So thankfully, right after we got married, we went to a Dave Ramsey conference here in California. He came out to Long Beach, California. And prior to going to his conference, I think I had a very skewed perspective about money. My family came from Korea when I was 8 years old. So with a lot of immigrant families, money management wasn't something that we discussed in the house. Money was always tight, and we knew that. But from my parents' perspective, their advice to be successful was go to college, study hard, go to college, get a good job, and good luck after that. So we followed that template, but I came into the working world without understanding how credit score worked, what good debt or bad debt was, how to invest, nothing like that. So of course, in my 20s, I made all of the wrong decisions. I bought a brand new car. I leased furniture. I leased an apartment that I couldn't afford. And so by the time I went to graduate school and we entered into our marriage, and listening to Dave Ramsey, where he calls you out on all these dumb decisions that I made, it just kind of really, really triggered something for both my wife and I that we had to get our act together. So we dialed back everything. We decided that we were going to live off one income and use the other to pay down the loan. So we were able to pay down the $105,000 in about 3.5 years.
Oh my gosh, that's incredible. In
Yeah, yeah. I
three
mean,
and a half years.
it was when we reflect on it, it was definitely, we call it both blessing and a curse because it was emotionally overwhelming, but at the same time, it taught us such a good money management skill, knowing how to live off a budget, knowing how to save, knowing how to say no to a lot of things. And honestly, it's hard, especially living in Orange County, where you see just this affluence everywhere, or this perspective of affluence everywhere.
Keeping up with the Joneses.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. So it definitely taught us good money management skills. So since then, after having paid off our student loan, we've definitely been able to get into better financial position. And during that time, we also, we had our children, and which triggered the decision to start cohabiting with my parents. I think for us, having this good financial management skill has really helped us tremendously as regards to not only take care of our kids, but then to an extent be able to provide overhead support for my parents.
So I have a question. First, I want to tell the listener who Dave Ramsey is, just in case you
Mhm.
haven't heard. Dave Ramsey has a very popular radio show and podcast where people come in and he helps them figure out how to get out of debt. His main thing is cut your expenses to the bone, get a second job, don't use credit. That's kind of what he
Mhm.
preaches. But also people come onto the show and they yell, "I'm debt free." Did you get to do that? "I'm debt free" yell?
No, no. I mean, we thought about it after we paid it off, but I think we were a little too shy.
Oh,
Yeah, yeah. We were, yeah.
okay, great. Now, do
Yeah.
your parents, so when your parents moved in with you,
Mhm.
so let's say I'm 65, 66 years old and I've made this great offer to my children
Mhm.
that I will basically give them the down payment.
Yeah.
And to the listener, if you want to know the whole story, just listen to the first episode. But the first episode of the series. Did you know about their finances? They knew that you were in debt. You
Yeah.
didn't ask them about their finances? Do you know anything about their finances now?
Yeah, I think I definitely know more. We didn't have a formal sit down and let's kind of open up everything. But what I've noticed is as we started to live together, my parents have deferred some of the decision making to both my wife and I. So I think through that, subtly we've learned more about their finances. But growing up as an immigrant family, my parents didn't know anything about retirement savings, 401ks, Roth IRAs, nothing like that. So I knew they didn't have any of that. So whatever money that they saved was really the down payment that they had for this home. Right now, with my parents, I know like my mom, she receives Social Security. My father has a small printing business where he generates some income from that, but he's also living off primarily from Social Security. But their primary saving was pretty much in this home. So that was thankfully their offer was, hey, we'll help you with the down payment, but with the caveat that we come with the home and you guys take care of all, majority of the overhead expenses.
Okay, so that's, it sounds like you're sharing information, but it's not formal.
Yeah, and I kind of scratch my head on like what the best way to approach a lot of these conversations at times, just because there's a fine line of trying to balance, hey, I need to know everything, but while respecting my parents' independence
Of
and their
course.
decision making. So I think definitely living together, we're able to have more natural, organic conversations where I learn more. But I don't know if I could sit down with them and be like, all right, let's learn everything.
Here, let me get out my pencil and I want to.
Exactly. Yeah. One of the ways that I've been able to have more conversations with them is my wife and I, we just are going through our will and trust process for just the two of us for our kids. So that's one of the ways that I've been able to kind of bring up the topic with my parents because they don't have a will or a trust set up.
That brings me, I just want to remind the listener what article we're discussing because I don't
Mhm.
think I said that at the beginning of the show. We are going through an article written in 2015. It's called How to Manage Your Parents, Your Kids, and Your Sanity. So the first part of the article talks about finances, and then the author, Charles Passy, I believe is how he pronounces
Mhm.
it, talks about seeking out the right professionals and organizations.
Yeah.
And one
Yeah.
of the things he talks about is that estate plan and getting things in place. So rather than just going to your parents and saying, hey, what's your estate plan? Do you have a power of
Right. Yep.
attorney? I want it. You're doing it and then leading them by example.
Right. Yeah. We just had this last couple of weeks where I come home and I tell my dad, like, hey, we just came back from meeting with the estate lawyer. It was very informative. We learned about this and this and this. And that naturally segues into like, what have you thought about your estate plan?
Right.
Or do you know of any lawyer, any Korean speaking lawyer? So then I think those are ways where I guess we can have more of that conversation and more of those information out open without kind of forcing them to be like, hey, we gotta talk about this.
That's great. That is great. Okay, let's see. What are some of the other things that they talk about? Now, this next one, it does say make time for yourself. Now, my experience is the wife, now it could be
Mhm.
different with millennials, but the wife, the burden in my generation is on the wife. So if I
Yes.
were, let's say I had children and I wanted to move in with one of them, the conflict would generally be between me and the daughter-in-law. Are
Mhm.
you finding that to be the case as well?
Oh, definitely. Yes. So it's funny whenever, I mean, it's been 6 years and both my wife and I, when we are able to kind of reflect upon what's happened, we're able to wisely say, oh, like, we've grown a lot. But there's a lot of times where I come home and I could just see it in my wife's eyes, like, oh no, like what happened between you and mom? And it's it's like, oh, the kitchen knife wasn't, like, I placed it here, how come your mom always moves it over here?
It
And
seems
like,
like your wife is always bringing up this knife situation.
it's the knife, it's the ladle, it's there's always something, but I
It's all
think
about
that's
the
the
kitchen.
yeah, it's definitely where the kitchen, I think we joke around how it's like the battleground
Mhm.
because we have one kitchen and it's a commingling space. It's utilized by a lot of people. It's been a challenge.
Do you have a solution for the kitchen, or is it still a work in progress?
It's a work in progress. I mean, we have some agreements that we come with my mom as regards to, for example, in the refrigerator, we would say, okay, these two top sections, like, please don't put anything here. This is for us. So then my wife knows that if she bought something from the grocery store, she always knows those are in those two sections.
Mhm.
And then, we have to keep reinforcing it, even though like my parents would be like, okay, okay, I get it. But, we have to keep reinforcing it. So I think what's helped out was just having different sections around the house that are identified as, these are our areas
Mm-hmm.
or these are your areas, and in the shared areas, kind of identifying what are the subsections in which, this is where we want to keep ours and this is where you keep your items. So those agreements have definitely helped out.
Are
But
there agreements regarding the children? How they're being raised? Has there been any arguments?
yes.
Because you did bring in your parents for financial reasons, but it turned
Mhm.
out that they're now also helping to co-raise your children. Have there
Yes.
been disagreements about children aren't allowed this and then the grandparents give them that, or for whatever reason? Has there
Oh,
been
definitely,
disagreements?
definitely. I mean, grandparents love to spoil the grandkids. So an example would be he'll come home late and my kids, their name's Jonathan, Catherine, they'll be like, hey, Jonathan, you and Catherine, do you guys want some ice cream? And it's like 9 p.m. at night. And we're like, oh, no, like that's not, we can't do that. So we've had to let grandpa know, like come to a level of agreement saying, hey, after 8 o'clock, can we make sure we're not giving them any snacks?
Especially sugar,
Yeah, especially sugar because they're not going to go to sleep.
or you're just
Um,
going to let them, just make them both sleep in grandpa and grandma's rooms. If they're all loaded
yeah,
with sugar, okay, you're
right,
sleeping over there tonight.
right. Then you have to deal with it. But it's definitely a fine balance between trying to, because we're also, one of the things that we talk about is we're still learning how to be good parents. We don't know what the best approach is. Coming to an agreement, but at the same time being open-minded that, hey, is this really that big of a deal? Aren't our children being able to live in a home where they feel loved? That's more important versus trying to uphold certain rules. And, to be honest, at times, like we're not even sure if that rule is the best rule. So I think it's just finding that right balance between trying to have the best parenting approach, but at the same time being open enough to know, kind of be able to step back and see the big picture and say, okay, the environment in which they grew up matters more.
Speaking of environment, what about the relationship with your wife and you? How has
Yeah.
that changed? I mean, obviously relationships change when there's children, but what about when there's children and parents in the home?
Yeah.
Do you have a lock on your bedroom door? How do you deal with that?
Yeah, so we do have our bedroom door does lock. So thankfully, the house that we live at is 4 bedrooms. The rooms are spaced out enough where we're not right next to each other. So there's 2 rooms on the one side of the house and 2 rooms in the other. So my parents use the 2 room on one side of the house, and we have the 2 room in the other. So there's a physical distance between the two, and we know to not, if we're going to enter into their space, we knock. We let them know that this is not our space. This is not like the kitchen where we can go in anytime. So coming to that arrangement, coming to that agreement of knowing like what's private space and what's shared space, that was very important.
Oh, that's good. And it's good that it seems to be working.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think once again, I referred to the kitchen earlier, the shared space battleground. There's no perfect agreement. I think we try to come to an agreement that works for both of us. That
Maybe
is,
building a little kitchenette in that second room, in the parents' area might be a good way to deal with that.
yeah, yeah. I mean, we've definitely thought about it. We have a lot of discussions as regards to like the finances. Like, oh, it'd be great if they had this in their area, like separate kitchenette. Do we want to invest the $10,000 there, or do we want to save that so we can have the flexibility down the line? So those are the trade-off discussions that we have.
Well, if it's only $10,000, I think that would be a bargain.
Right, right, yeah,
I don't
yeah.
think you could put it. I could be wrong, but I don't think you could put in a kitchenette for
Maybe
10,000.
like really tiny kitchenette in the
Yeah, like
corner.
maybe you could go buy a burner at Costco
Right, right.
and a small refrigerator. So yeah, it sounds like you're still a work in progress when it comes to
Definitely, definitely
getting
working.
things worked out. What are some of the other issues that maybe the article didn't go over that you've come across?
The article talks about making time for yourself and making time for your loved ones. So I think having quality time with my wife, I think that's been crucial, like intentional quality time, just because having my parents there, having our children there, if we are not intentional, weeks can go by without us having our own time. My wife's been really good at kind of alerting me saying, hey, we need to go for a walk, or you and I need to go out so we can take advantage of the built-in childcare. So we would, ask my parents, can you just watch the kids for just the evening while we go out for dinner? It's one of those things where if we're not intentional about it, like it wouldn't happen. Having alone time a couple times a week, debrief about what happened, talk about the kitchen knife,
Right.
how she feels about it, talking about the feeling in which I'm not in control, knowing that this is the challenge of living in a multi-generational household. If you're not talking to your partner about this on a regular basis, that's where things can really fall apart.
Right. Now, what about your parents? Do they schedule their alone time as well? Do they have a date night?
Oh yeah, I mean I think when I was referring to how roles have reversed, it's funny because they would go out and do their thing, and it's like 9 o'clock at night, and I'm texting them like, hey, you
Where
guys
are
are
you?
like late, like where are you? Like you shouldn't be out this late. So it's interesting because like we joke around or like it's like I feel like we have 4 kids in this house sometimes,
But they're
but
adults.
they're adults. They're pretty good about spending time with each other. They're very involved we live in a community where there's a large Korean population,
Mhm.
and the church is a pretty big hub for the Korean community. So they spend a lot of time at the church. That's their community, which we recognize is so important. Just that sense of being around people, the similar life stage is so important for them.
That's great. Now, your parents are still relatively young. They're
Mhm.
the same age as much of my audience.
Mhm.
But in 10 years or so, they may or may not be driving. One of
Right.
the nice thing about living in today's society is we have Uber, Lyft, and probably in 10 years we'll have self-driving cars.
Mhm.
Have you given much thought to the future and what your life is going to look like having your parents live it in your home?
Yeah, I mean, it's my wife and I, we discussed a lot about like what the next 10 years would look like, especially with our parents. I think there's a lot of unknowns, but I think what we've come to an agreement is that as we've noticed how our parents become more subtly dependent upon us, we are going to need to. So we are looking at it from a financial perspective. We want to be financially prepared so that when that time comes where they might need more support from one of us, whether it's, driving them around or being at home more often, that one of us could, leave our jobs or take a temporary time off our jobs, and it would be okay. It wouldn't have a detrimental effect on us. So
That's
I think we're thinking from that perspective because we'll never be fully prepared, I don't think, what kind of support my parents are going to need, but it's inevitable. So I think we're just trying to financially be best prepared as possible for that.
that's great. Well, I am so glad that you were able to come on the show again. And next week, we're going to be talking about an article written by Melissa. I don't have a last name, but it's called Is Multi-Generational Living for You? What are the pros and cons? And we've already discussed some of the pros and cons, but we're hoping that the article will bring in some new thought processes in your own quest of whether or not you should do the same thing that Tay's parents did, offer to help out with the finances and potentially help out with the child care as well. Tay, thank you so much for coming on the show again. I really appreciate it.
Great. Thank you, Kathy.
Thank you. And for the listener, we'll see you next time on Rock Your Retirement. Hey, this is just a shout out to Glenna Davis, and she has been a big supporter of mine on Patreon. And Glenna, if you're listening, I just wanted to thank you.